recently you became the main character on Twitter, let's say, for some of your opinions behind how packages should support older versions of Node. Somebody found that you support all the way back to 0.4, which is like almost the start, I think. So, why do you think that supporting these older Node versions is so important?
Good question. So the particular incident you're referring to is flooded with misinformation and wildly inaccurate misunderstandings or inaccurate understandings. But setting that aside, so the first thing is I am a firm believer in semantic versioning. So the fastest way you can get a lot of people angry at you, even faster than I got people angry at me, is to make a breaking change in a non-major version. Um, React and TypeScript have a modified version of SemVer or a form of SemVer and cause these issues in minor versions, and they get flack for it every time, despite years of saying, here, we don't actually follow SemVer, we follow a version of it, right? So if you want to drop support for something as a package author, okay, right? Like with respect to SemVer, go for it, but do it in a major version bump. That's all. So that's the first thing. And part of that, like in the NPM ecosystem, there's the extra wrinkle that the engine's declaration, if you don't have it, it defaults to star. That is in the docs. It's always been the case. And so if you haven't said explicitly what your Node version support range is for a package, you have to support everything. And if you want to make a more pragmatic argument, you have to support everything that worked and it was reasonably expected. And it was like reasonable for users to expect it to keep working. So when you did V, 2.0.0, if something worked and it was a reasonable use of the library, then in version 1.248 or 2.48 or whatever, like you can't suddenly break it. Even if you didn't actually want to support their environment or whatever, you have to do a V3 to drop that support, or you have to support it. So that's kind of the one angle of it. But the other thing is, and this is partially informed by my experience in ecosystems like Rails, where when you force somebody to do an upgrade by doing a major version, right? Because a major version, everything stops, right? You can't just seamlessly upgrade to it. You have to review the changelog. You might have to change things. You might not. You might have to make sure your environment is compatible. Maybe you already are. But it's a big deal. It's a high cost process to by publishing a major version bump, you have imposed a cost automatically on the ecosystem, and it's significant. The difficulty of updating bit is that the thing that in many of my past employers has held us back from upgrading the most by a large margin is these types of compatibility problems. Like in order for me to upgrade a Rails or Node or PHP, I have to make it so that move is as small and as possible so that the risk is as low as possible. And the more dependencies I have to change at the same time, the harder that is. And so it's a lot easier to do 100 pull requests, updating 99 dependencies and a platform than it is to do one pull request, updating them all at once. And I'm far more likely to get in trouble or like cause a production incident if I do the single PR versus the separate PRs. So I never want my packages, ideally, to be the reason that an upgrade is harder. I don't support Node 0.4 because I think people should be using old Node or old browsers, right? Part of my also argument is that it's easy to test on Node 0.4 and CI, and that gives me JavaScript environments that are similar to a lot of old browsers. So I can make sure that I'm not depending on features that, would break eventually in a web browser that I'm not otherwise testing for. So that's part of it, right? If I got a reliable automated in-browser testing solution to cover old browsers, I probably wouldn't support old Node anymore. I would just support browsers and new Node. That still might create the same constraints on my packages, but it would more clearly explain what I care about. And that's also because all of my experience looking at the internal private analytics of all of these employers is that the idea that everybody updates their browsers or that any browser is evergreen is just completely blatantly false. Tons and tons of people, like enough to make any developer cry, are stuck on old browsers, and the reason that they're upgrading is not the website still works. The reason they're not upgrading is that something else is hard. Either they don't have enough disk space, or they don't know how to do it, or they're on a locked down computer because they're in some computer lab and they can't make the changes, right? You breaking your website is not going to force them to upgrade. It is just going to hurt a human being. And when you think about things in terms of human beings affected instead of percentages, it becomes a lot harder to justify dropping support of stuff. And so I've long ago developed a sort of human-centered approach, which is that I would rather I would rather inconvenience the majority than exclude the minority. And it's fine if people don't share that preference, that that ethos or whatever. But that decision means that I want to maximize compatibility for my packages. I want to make it easier. Like you can use, no matter what version like of Node you're using, you can upgrade my packages to the latest and ship it. And then you don't have to deal with any of my code when you're actually upgrading Node. And that makes upgrading Node easier. That is the opposite of holding the ecosystem back, in my view.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with the upgrading packages story. Like 10 out of 10 times, it is always a breaking change somewhere else that's holding me back. Like upgrading more than one
Yep.
dependency at a time is just fraught with terror. So the ability to only do it one at a time is pretty big.
And then the other angle is about vulnerabilities. Like lots of majors strand a bunch of users on old versions. So for example, there's a popular NPM author. He has a lot of packages. He makes breaking changes quickly, like frequently. The theory, as generally it's because or at least pre-ESM, the stated reason was that they want to just use new shiny syntax and they don't want to have to care about users of old things. So they just make a major, and to their credit, they always followed SemVer and they did a major bump. But then when a vulnerability gets filed on one of their libraries, it's like version 2 through 5 is affected. And then they publish a fix on V5. All the users on versions 2, 3, and 4 are screwed. And then the maintainer has to do more work to do a backport, or they have to leave a bunch of users out in the cold, or those users have to do a bunch more work to upgrade, which is, for all the reasons we've discussed, might not even be possible. And then there's other reasons too, which I've only understood since coming to work at Herodes. There's companies that have they're government contractors or whatever, and they could have contractual legal requirements that they are not allowed to update their dependencies because of stability, but they still also are required to have no vulnerabilities. And so they're in an extra bind, and that's where Herodev's business comes from. And so the creating a major version is a very high cost. And the other thing is you can go look at there's a great website, majors.nullvoxpopuli.com, and you can type in an npm package name and group it either by majors or also by minors, and it'll show you the last week's worth of downloads on that package. And I think people would be shocked if they looked at maybe not top level direct dependencies like frameworks and Webpack and ESLint and Babel, like tools, right? Those are probably more healthy. But if you look at the graphs of a lot of transitive dependencies, I wouldn't describe them as healthy, because you see these spikes in the older unmaintained versions. And in that case, what that means empirically is the ecosystem did not want the breaking change enough to upgrade to it. And the ecosystem here might be lots of people, but it also might be 10 people who are, who have popular packages that are feeding the priming the downloads for that transitive dependency. But nonetheless, that's your consumer, right? And so if your consumer doesn't want to upgrade to you, you screwed up, and you can choose to not fix that, or you can choose to try and fix that. Or you can choose to avoid the problem entirely by not doing a breaking change. And that is usually what I opt for.
Yeah, I've definitely been in those package situations. In my eye, I've harped on it on this show a lot. ESM versus CJS was such a mistake on so many levels.
And that would be a whole other podcast. And it does I didn't mention it when you asked about TC39 mistakes, because it would be a whole other podcast or 7. But it's the same with packages that go ESM only. What they have done is they have made a breaking change that makes it impossible for some users to use them. And you can go look at that website I mentioned and see how the number of users that there's somebody who's been making graphs of how many popular packages have migrated to ESM. And if you look at those same numbers by where users are assigned to versions instead of like, where it's like I think the way they're doing it is all downloads are grouped by the latest version. But if you actually look at the specific version that is being downloaded, people aren't using native ESM yet. And the way to change that isn't to make everybody else's life harder in the meantime. There are ways to change that, but that's not it.